Hi everyone, welcome back to our RBT training. Today we're going to be discussing the ABCs of behavior analysis. Okay, just as you have the ABCs of the alphabet, the ABCs are incredibly important to behavioral analysis. And understanding this topic is going to be one of the most important parts of your behavioral training. So let's get started. What's ABC? All right, so ABC can be defined as antecedent, behavior, and consequence. I'm going to let you stop now, make a SAFMED card for it. Great, so your SAFMED card should have on one side A, B, C, and then the definition on the other is acronym for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. All right, add it to your pile for later. All right, so let's write this up on the board. A, B, and C. Pretty easy, right? And as we said, A stands for antecedent. B stands for behavior. And C stands for consequence. All right. Often you're going to see this in a chart-like form, so I'm going to do that for us now. All right. So since we're talking about definitions, let's define exactly what an antecedent is, what a behavior is, and what a consequence is before we go into more depth with this skill area. So, an antecedent is anything that happens immediately before the targeted behavior for interest. Let's write it on a SAFMED card. So on one side, you should have antecedent as your definition, or as your term. And on the other, you can write the definition. Now the definition varies a little bit in your PowerPoint. You can use that one, or you can use the one that I just used. The one in your PowerPoint says a stimulus that exists just prior to a behavior. Remember, a stimulus is anything. So it can be an event, it can be a person, it can be a bumblebee flying by, okay? Anything that happens immediately before a behavior is an antecedent. Other types of antecedents, and this is something good to keep in mind, because it can also include things that happen before the behavior, but not necessarily immediately before, okay? And this specific type of antecedent is called a setting event. You don't have to write a definition card for it. It most likely will not show up on your final exam. However, setting events are things that might influence the behavior. Can you think of anything that might influence your behavior at work that might have happened in the morning before you left the house? Right? I think you can think of a million things. It could be that you got some bad sleep last night. So then when you get to work, your behavior, it might not be the best, right? You might not be 100% able to recall facts and quotes and numbers quickly. You might be less talkative with staff. You might be a little bit more easily agitated with things. So your behavior can be a direct reflection of things that happened further in the day, okay, or before the behavior, not right immediately before. But for the most part, when we talk about antecedents, we are going to talk about things that happen immediately before the behavior. So for example, if a bee flew by and I ran away screaming, and as a consequence I escaped the bee, then we could pretty much say that the antecedent was the bee to me running away and screaming, okay? So that happened immediately before. All right, those are our antecedents. Let's go on to a behavior. We've talked about behavior before, and the fact that a behavior can be defined as any observable and measurable movement or activity a person does. But remember, the key there is that it's observable and measurable when we define it for our purposes in applied behavioral analysis, because we rely on that numeracy in order to collect data and show and demonstrate change, right? It needs to be measurable. It can't be internal thoughts or things that are hard to really accurately and reliably measure. So again, let's make a SACMED card for it. Behavior is the term on one side. And then the definition on the other is any observable and measurable movement or activity a person does. Remember, it could be a thing too, right? It could be an animal. All right, so we've got our behavior. I'm sure that you can come up with a million different examples of behavior. But again, remember, it has to be measurable, it has to be observable. And when we define behavior, which we'll get into a little bit later, especially when it comes to making hypothesis and target behaviors that we're looking to really define when we're doing those behavioral assessments, we need to make sure that we're defining it with enough clarity and precision so that no matter who observes the behavior, everyone can measure it the same way. Okay, and that's what we call an operational definition. And if you go back to your 7 dimensions of applied behavioral analysis, can you think of which dimension that applies to? Conceptually systematic, right? Or technological, right? It's written with such clarity and definition that no matter who picks it up, everyone is going to be able to identify and measure that behavior in the same way. All right, great. So we have our behavior, and then let's get into consequence. So a consequence is anything that happens immediately after the behavior. So an example of a consequence might be asking your dog to sit. The dog sits, and then you give a treat. It's a positive consequence, right? Good. Or you could tell your dog to sit. Your dog doesn't sit. So instead, you guide his tail and hiney to the floor, and you do not provide a treat. Also a consequence, okay? But one is negative and one is positive. And we're going to talk a little bit about why one is negative and one is positive when we talk about negative versus positive reinforcement. Because a lot of our behavior change is going to come dependent on the consequence of a behavior. And that, I'm sure, makes a little bit of sense to you. But sometimes our behavior change is also based on antecedents, which is a little bit more of a complex topic, but we will delve into that a little bit later in the training. All right, great. So let's make sure that we have a definition for our consequence, okay? So on one side, you should have the term consequence. And on the other, you should have the definition that includes a stimulus that occurs immediately following a behavior. Or it can be anything that occurs immediately after a behavior. So now that we have our ABCs down, let's talk a little bit more about what this is also called. The ABCs can also be referred to as a three-term contingency, okay? Because typically behavior is built off of these three things in a row. We've got the antecedent, the behavior, and then a consequence. So they're all contingent on one another, hence the three-term contingency. An antecedent is something that comes before a behavior, as we talked about. It could trigger a behavior. And a behavior is anything an individual does. And then the consequence is something that follows a behavior. So here are some facts about ABCs. Looking at a behavior from an ABC perspective is part of a comprehensive functional assessment of behavior. So if we get a call that there's a concern over a child running away in school, running out of his classroom, they're going to say, can you come in and do an FBA, or functional behavioral assessment? And we'll say, sure. What's the target behavior? They're looking at elopement or running away, right? So we would say our behavior, and that is running away. Okay? And then we would apply an operational definition to that to make sure that we're working within a technological fashion, right? And our operational definition would be extremely specific. So it might be something like anytime the individual runs or walks more than 15 feet away from an adult, and when asked to stop, does not comply. If that individual or student does that across the day, it's going to be counted as one instance of that target behavior. All right. So by assessing that target behavior across the day, we can then further analyze exactly why it's occurring and what's maintaining that behavior. And we'll get into that in a minute or two, but I'm going to show you a variety of different what we call ABC data sheets that we use in order to collect that information about what's happening right before the behavior and what's happening right afterwards. All right, so let's move on a little. An ABC model can also be effective in increasing a behavior. So for example, we can use specific antecedents to trigger behavior we want to increase, right? And follow the behavior with a consequence that will increase or maintain the behavior. It also enables us to see what's going on in the environment before the behavior that might trigger it and what happens afterwards to maintain it, which we already discussed. Okay, so collecting data in ABC format does not require extensive skill or time. This data is helpful to the person writing a plan. Many times the data forms for ABC data collection are simple checklists or grids that are easy to use. So let's take a peek at those now. All right, this is our first grid. This is an example of what we would call an ABC checklist. All right. There are 3 different columns here, just as we have on our board in the back. We have antecedent, behavior, and consequence. In our antecedent column, we have such examples as given a direction or activity, asked to wait, new task, difficult task, preferred activity, loud, noisy environment, transition between activities, attention given to others, asked to wait, left alone, okay? Various amounts of variables or activities or things that might be going on in the environment. Then we have the behavior. Some examples here on our checklist are scratching, biting, spitting, kicking, flopping, running away, destroying of property, the list goes on, right? And then as consequences, we have a few that are specific to doing FBAs. And we'll discuss a little bit more about how you get that specificity and why, because there are some reasons We've got verbal redirection, physical assist, ignore problem behavior, kept demand on, verbal reprimand, left alone, loss of privileges, peer remarks, timeout, okay? And so an ABC checklist is super easy to use for paraprofessionals or other staff or teachers because all they have to do is just look at it and place a check on whatever was functional and accurate for and relevant to that behavior. All right? There's no filling in of, well, this happened and then this happened and then this happened and this happened and then 5 minutes later you're done writing all of your notes from the tantrum episode. Nope, this is just a quick check, 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 done. All right? But it doesn't allow for specificity because there are all of these behaviors in here in antecedents and consequences. So what I might do for something like this is actually take this sheet and narrow it down so it's more student or behavior specific. So we would say, all right, which of these behaviors are a concern? Let's get rid of the rest, right? Okay, we've got running away and maybe scratching. Good, those are the two that we leave. Okay, what's typically happening in the environment? Transitions, maybe asked to wait, asked to start an activity. So then we can start narrowing some of these down. So you see it becomes even easier to use. Now we talked about our consequences and why we choose specific consequences in here. And that's because when we talk about behavior, there are actually only 4 real functions to behavior that we can categorize our consequences into, okay? And those are typically, we've got, I'll write them down here. We've got gaining access, to attention, and then we have the same thing, gaining access, but this time it's to items or activities. These are what we would call tangibles, okay? So gaining access to attention, gaining access to item or activities. The third is escape or avoidance. Some people might either further break that down into escape or avoidance of attention or people, and escape and avoidance of demands, such as like a work activity or a request. All right. And then last but not least, we have sensory or alone as our last condition. So these are the 4 functions of behavior. So when we make hypotheses about exactly why a behavior is occurring, we'll say it's hypothesized that the behavior of running away, for example, if when running away they escape having to do work, so in here our antecedent would probably be what? It would probably be given a work task, student runs away, and then in consequence, immediately after